if you're going to ultimately get a deal and negotiate, both sides have to decide that they're better off taking a deal than continuing to fight this on the battlefield. And we do have, I think, a number of signs now that it seems Putin thinks that he may be better off fighting this on the battlefield, or at least making one last big push this summer with another offensive to see how much more territory he can physically take. And so my sense is that's probably what's going on here, is he wants to see what else he can accomplish on the battlefield, and then he might be more open to negotiations.
What are we sending at this point, Kelly, to Ukraine in terms of military hardware, in terms of, I guess, logistical support, or is the spigot beginning to run dry? When is Ukraine on its own?
Yeah, so, I mean, one of the big announcements about 2 weeks ago was that we were sending more air defenses. That came out of, around the same time as the mineral agreement was signed with Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So that I think is quite important, because that's one area where the United States is one of the only countries that can provide like Patriot interceptors that Ukraine needs. The other thing we know is that we're continuing to provide a lot of intelligence support. That's being done through European Command and NATO. That's really critical, even though we don't see it. It helps them a lot with targeting. But the real issue here becomes that the funding is, nearly out for providing additional aid. So the question then becomes whether Congress is going to authorize a new package. And, based on last time, there would be reasons to think that that's going to be really hard to do. And I think a lot will depend probably on whether Trump is still thinking that he can make a deal with Putin, or if he starts to become so frustrated with them that he decides to sort of ratchet up some of the pressure on Putin and maybe support some kind of package.
Well, as we consider both sides' positions here, and to your point about Putin perhaps thinking he might have a better hand here if he continues to pursue this war on the ground, we understand that the Russian delegation was demanding in talks today control of 5 Ukrainian regions, inclusive of Crimea, but also looking at Zaporizhia, for example, Donetsk, the kind of regions where we're familiar with that they've been jockeying for control of. Do the Russians have the controlling position in all of these areas right now, or is there still a chance that Ukraine can regain this territory before we get to some kind of negotiated settlement?
No, I mean, I think I would phrase it a little differently and say that right now the Russians are asking for parts of territory that they don't actually have under their control. They have made tremendous advances in all of those regions, but they don't completely control, for example, all of Donetsk. And I would expect actually this summer offensive rather, would probably focus a lot on trying to capture the rest of Donetsk. But I think that's part of the issue, is that where you don't have actually forces that are controlling territory, the Ukrainians are signaling, we're not prepared to hand you more territory. And so I think that's really one of the key areas of dispute right now, is exactly where the territorial lines will be. And I, there's a danger here, I think, that Putin's actually overplaying his hand, and that, instead of being willing to compromise of the territory that he's holding and go to a peace deal, he seems to want all control of all of these 5 territories. And I think the question will be whether he's able to accomplish that on the battlefield this summer. And if not, if he'll finally concede that it's not worth the continued cost of fighting and that he's had enough. He's satisfied with what he has.
Mm-hmm. President Trump's been talking a lot about Iran this week. Kelly Grieco, first it was word of an olive branch, as he put it, news of a written proposal for a nuclear deal that went to Tehran. Today, on Truth Social, he writes, they have a proposal. More importantly, they know they have to move quickly or something bad is going to happen, he wrote. That's a direct quote, which apparently caused a great deal of confusion in Tehran. I'd like to ask you about the battle plan that he's referring to. What exactly would we do to move against Iran militarily? Would it be bunker-busting bombs to go after nuclear facilities, or more than that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not entirely clear what, the military plan would be. I would say, though, that we have been building up forces in the region, including bomber deployments in particular, including the type of bombers that can carry those really large bunker busting bombs. I think that buildup of bombers does have some kind of latent coercive threat that potentially we would strike facilities in Iran. Of course, that would be a major escalation. And, the real risk then is that we'd end up in some kind of regional war. The other possibility is that we'd be willing to sign off on something, including possibly supplying the Israelis with some capabilities they might need to conduct some kinds of strikes against Iran. But, I think it's clear he's trying to use this sort of as a latent threat to create some pressure for negotiations, which is sort of what you do with these kinds of negotiations. But I would just say it's interesting to see that the Iranians seem at least somewhat receptive to trying to find a deal.
Well, the Iranian foreign minister, in response to the suggestion from President Trump that they should have something in hand, said on X today, Iran has not received any written proposal from the United States, whether directly or indirectly. He goes on to say, Kelly, in the meantime, the messaging we and the world continue to receive is confusing and contradictory. If it is indeed confusing, do you see the circumstances taking shape in which Iran is going to be willing to agree to something specific from the United States, or do those specifics still have much work to do to be ironed out?
Yeah, I mean, it's clear the specifics have much work to do to be ironed out. I think what we're getting at is actually something that we're seeing similarly with the Ukraine attempts at Ukraine peace deal, which is that President Trump very much sees diplomacy and making these sort of deals about interaction with himself, with another leader, where traditionally diplomacy, these kinds of really hard to get deals, there's a lot of groundwork that's laid before the leaders even meet to try to iron out all the details to find compromise and really pave the way for the leaders to essentially, at that point, agree to the terms. He tends to not do as much of the former and focuses more on the latter. And so I think we're seeing some of this play out with the Iranians as well, in that they're accustomed to that process where you work this out at a lower level and iron out terms, and not sort of Trump's more very direct, often even public approach. And I can understand why it creates confusion. This is, I think, one of the risks inherent with his approach to diplomacy.